And they say I was lying. I say, if I'm lying, all of you join me. Let us go to Nyarwe Farm District. Go and prove me wrong with the people on the ground. They say the number that I mentioned on social media was lie.
In moments of national tension, the power of testimony becomes more than a personal narrative. It evolves into a collective reflection of lived realities, anxieties, and hopes carried by communities who feel unseen or unheard. The statements made by Reverend Ezekiel Dachomo provide a deeply emotional and challenging account, one anchored in personal suffering and in the pressing concerns that he believes shape the daily experience of the people under his care. As we explore this narrative with a calm and objective voice, it becomes important to look at every sentence with care, to consider the layers behind the emotions, to understand the implications of the claims, and to reflect on the broader dynamics of society, conflict, leadership, security, and faith. And as we journey through this analysis, I invite you to stay engaged, to reflect critically, and to consider sharing your perspective in the comments below. If you find value in thoughtful analysis like this, remember to subscribe so you don't miss future breakdowns that aim to bring clarity without sensationalism. Reverend Dachomo begins from a place of personal vulnerability, recalling his survival from what he described as full-blown cancer treated in India. This alone sets a dramatic emotional frame, because for many listeners, a person returning from a life-threatening illness occupies a symbolic space, someone who has walked through suffering and returned with a heightened sensitivity to injustice. In this context, the Reverend presents himself as someone who fought death in one form, only to return and face another through the violence affecting his community. This juxtaposition serves as a rhetorical foundation, inviting the audience to understand his message not as political commentary but as existential testimony. That framing alone naturally captures attention, and for viewers watching on platforms like YouTube, this is often the moment when many feel compelled to leave a comment expressing solidarity or shock. Feel free to share your thoughts as we continue, and if the analysis brings clarity to a complex crisis, remember to like the video so it reaches others seeking understanding. As he narrates his experience, Reverend Dachomo references statements allegedly made by a figure named Yehia Jinri, whom he claims discouraged the arrest of certain individuals he identifies with a specific ethnic group. In interpreting this part of his testimony, it is crucial to maintain objectivity and avoid framing entire communities under singular labels, especially on a public platform requiring careful language to remain respectful and compliant with safety policies. His narrative expresses frustration with what he perceives as selective protection, and whether or not the claim is fully verifiable, it demonstrates the level of mistrust that exists between local communities and certain state or security institutions. These feelings do not emerge spontaneously, they tend to be shaped by history, lived experience, and a perception of unequal treatment by structures meant to be neutral. This dynamic is important to analyze without endorsing any form of ethnic generalization. As we move deeper into the Reverend's words, feel free to comment below about how trust in institutions shapes stability in any society, and consider subscribing for future analyses exploring public narratives and national cohesion. The Reverend then speaks of returning home to discover that 27 people had been killed. Such an event, if confirmed, would naturally heighten fear, trauma, and anger within any community. Regardless of the specific identities involved, the loss of human life is always a tragedy, and leaders, whether religious, traditional, or civic, often find themselves overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility placed upon them by those who look to them for direction. The Reverend's tone reflects this weight. He mentions feeling physically exhausted during an executive council meeting of his church, struggling to sleep under the emotional stress of receiving reports from villages under his care. This dimension of the narrative shows the human side of leadership, one that often remains invisible to the public eye. Behind many public statements lies a person trying to balance personal recovery, community expectations, and the fear of not doing enough. As you listen, you might resonate with the human pressure carried by leaders in difficult circumstances. If you do, you might want to share your reflections in the comments and help others engage in a constructive conversation. He speaks extensively about villages such as Nyawi, Bindi, Rim, and Jolly, rural communities he describes as living under constant anxiety due to ongoing insecurity. According to his account, community members struggle to sleep, always anticipating another attack, and this sense of constant alertness becomes part of the psychological environment. When a community can no longer rest, the social fabric becomes strained, and everyday activities that people take for granted suddenly become acts of courage. From a sociological point of view, the Reverend's account reflects a classic pattern of communities facing protracted insecurity, disrupted routines, constant fear, mistrust of outsiders, and a deep dependency on local leaders who become emotional anchors. This kind of psychological stress is not unique to one region of Nigeria, it has been observed in various conflict-affected zones around the world. Nonetheless, Reverend Dachomo's words offer a localized window into this global phenomenon. If you find these insights helpful in understanding how insecurity affects communities, consider subscribing for more long-form analysis crafted to bring nuance to sensitive issues. The Reverend then transitions into a theological interpretation of his survival, saying that God preserved him so that he could speak on behalf of what he calls his United Kingdom. In many religious traditions, the idea that suffering or survival gives someone a mandate plays a powerful symbolic role. It can strengthen the emotional authority of a speaker and influence how their message is received by followers. At the same time, when analyzing such claims, it is important to separate spiritual conviction from political implication. While Reverend Dachomo speaks from the heart, engaging with the spiritual significance of his survival, our task here is to explore the narrative without endorsing or dismissing the theological interpretation. We focus instead on how this framing affects the dynamics of community mobilization, identity formation, and civic response. As the Reverend appeals to global powers including Washington, D.C., the White House, and specific former leaders, this shows the tendency of local communities to seek external validation or assistance when they believe national mechanisms are insufficient. Whether or not such appeals lead to concrete action, they reflect the interconnectedness of global narratives with local realities. You are welcome to share your thoughts on this global-local dynamic in the comments, and if these deep dives into public messaging resonate with you, feel free to like and share. As the Reverend continues, he voices concerns that individuals from other African countries are allegedly being invited into Nigeria to take over land or communities. These claims, often circulated in public discourse, reflect widespread anxieties about identity, land ownership, demographic shifts, and the fear of displacement. From an analytical standpoint, it is essential to treat such claims cautiously, focusing on the psychological factors rather than accepting them at face value without verification. The Reverend's statements show how rumors or perceptions, whether accurate or exaggerated, can fuel fear and shape community behavior. In conflict analysis, perception often carries as much power as reality. If a community believes it is under threat, its actions will follow that belief, regardless of whether the threat is as large or organized as imagined. He then speaks in dramatic terms about his willingness to face what he metaphorically describes as another cancer, referring to insecurity. This rhetorical approach is common when leaders try to convey determination. It gives listeners a sense of resilience, a refusal to surrender despite suffering. In communication psychology, such statements can inspire followers or reinforce group identity, especially in moments of crisis. However, it also heightens the emotional temperature of the discourse, making it easier for statements to be interpreted as calls for confrontation rather than calls for resilience. As we interpret these words, it is important to remain sensitive to the emotional context that generated them. This analysis is not a judgment of his intentions but rather a reflection on how messages can be received by diverse audiences. If you want more long-form explorations of how public speeches shape collective behavior, remember to subscribe and share as we continue unpacking this narrative. The Reverend expresses despair about destroyed crops, hunger concerns, and the inability of villagers to return safely to their farms. This reflects a major issue in conflict-affected rural areas, the breakdown of agricultural cycles, which leads to food insecurity and long-term economic destabilization. When farms become unsafe, families lose their primary source of livelihood. Food prices rise, malnutrition increases, and communities become even more vulnerable. The Reverend's statement about destroyed crops reveal more than frustration, they expose the socio-economic cost of insecurity. This kind of disruption can ripple across generations, affecting education, health, and migration. Understanding the long-term consequences helps ground the conversation beyond emotional appeals, demonstrating the structural issues contributing to hardship in many regions. If you believe people need more information about how conflict affects economic stability, feel free to comment and share your thoughts below. Another notable segment of the Reverend's message focuses on the relationship between community leaders and their followers. He criticizes what he perceives as failures by leaders from other groups to calm tensions, framing this as a moral and civic responsibility. In analyzing this, it's important to consider the broader challenge leaders face during volatile moments. Conflict escalation often results from a complex web of miscommunication, historical grievances, and inflammatory rhetoric. Leaders play a crucial role in either de-escalating or intensifying tension, even unintentionally. When Reverend Dachomo urges accountability from others, he is engaging in a public form of moral persuasion. Whether one agrees or disagrees, his words highlight how leadership becomes a contested arena in times of crisis. These dynamics are crucial to understand for anyone interested in conflict resolution, governance, and peace building. And if these insights are helpful, consider subscribing for more discussions that aim to approach difficult topics responsibly. As the Reverend shifts into theological metaphors about salt, he refers to the symbolic Christian concept of salt representing preservation, purification, and moral integrity. In many traditions, salt symbolizes the role of believers in maintaining stability and resisting moral decay. Here, Reverend Dachomo applies the metaphor to national development, urging his followers to see themselves as agents of purification and protection. From a communication standpoint, such metaphors serve to uplift morale and unify the audience around shared values. They transform ordinary individuals into symbolic defenders of societal well-being. However, in public discourse, particularly in a diverse country with multiple religions and identities, metaphors can be interpreted differently depending on the audience. While Reverend Dachomo intends a message of spiritual empowerment, listeners outside his community may hear it through a different lens. This is why careful language is essential in public platforms, especially those like YouTube where messages reach broad audiences across beliefs and regions. If you appreciate critical yet respectful interpretations of sensitive rhetoric, remember to like and subscribe as we continue. He emphasizes repeatedly that his intention is not to curse anyone but to defend his people through prayer. This part of the message is important, because it indicates an attempt, whether fully consistent or not, to frame his response within nonviolent religious language. He asserts that spiritual methods such as prayer will be his primary means of resisting harm. From an analytical perspective, this is significant, as it differentiates his approach from explicit calls for violence, which would be unacceptable and dangerous on any public platform. His emphasis on prayer reflects a belief in spiritual warfare, a common narrative in many Christian communities where conflict is framed as a battle between moral forces rather than between ethnic or political groups. Understanding this framing helps clarify the emotional tone of his message without endorsing any confrontational interpretations. If this kind of balanced analysis helps you understand public statements more deeply, remember to share and continue the discussion below. The Reverend's emotional appeal reaches its height when he directs a command to the youth across various villages, urging them to rise in self-defense. It is essential to interpret this carefully. In conflict analysis, calls for self-defense can carry different meanings depending on the context. Some communities interpret self-defense in terms of vigilance, early warning, community watch, or nonviolent protective measures. Others may interpret it in physical or confrontational terms. For responsible public discourse, especially on YouTube, it is important to frame this part of the message within lawful and nonviolent interpretations. The Reverend's frustration and fear for the safety of his community are clear, and they reflect the lived reality of many rural populations experiencing insecurity. However, encouraging lawful protection mechanisms, seeking cooperation with authorities, and emphasizing peaceful conflict resolution remain crucial. As we present this analysis, we aim to do so with respect for YouTube's safety guidelines while remaining faithful to the depth of the Reverend's emotions. If you want more nuanced explorations of sensitive statements like this, consider subscribing to support thoughtful content. He warns that failure to protect the community could jeopardize the next generation, reflecting a common fear in conflict zones, the fear of erasure, displacement, or loss of cultural identity. This emotional argument is widely used by leaders trying to mobilize attention toward crises that they feel are ignored by broader institutions. Understanding this helps reveal the deeper psychological layers behind the Reverend's urgency. His choice of words reflects the anxiety of communities who believe they are at risk of losing their land, heritage, or people. These feelings, even if expressed in dramatic language, cannot be dismissed without consideration. They reflect deeply rooted fears shaped by historical tensions, socioeconomic pressures, and a sense of marginalization. As you listen, if you feel this analysis helps bring clarity to emotional narratives, feel free to comment your thoughts and share the content with others seeking understanding. The Reverend frames the crisis as religiously biased, expressing concern that Christians are being targeted and that the government is allegedly reluctant to take decisive action. Again, such claims need careful analysis to avoid generalizations or unverified accusations. However, they do reveal the perception of inequality or neglect felt by certain communities. Perception itself becomes a driving force behind group behavior, often reinforcing identity boundaries and shaping political discourse. When individuals believe they are not protected equally under the law, their trust in institutions diminishes, making cooperative governance more difficult. This is why communication from both government and community leaders must be transparent and proactive. In the absence of clear information, rumors and anxieties fill the gap. If analyses like this deepen your understanding of conflict communication, consider subscribing for more long-form insights crafted with care. The Reverend ends this part of his message with a powerful but troubling prediction that one day people may hear news of his death. While emotional, statements like this serve as rhetorical devices used to convey the severity of the situation. They reflect the fear and frustration felt by individuals who believe they are constantly under threat. It is essential to approach such statements with empathy but also with analytical distance, recognizing them as expressions of distress rather than literal expectation. Many leaders under similar pressures use dramatic language to highlight their vulnerability and the urgency of their cause. Understanding this helps differentiate between emotional rhetoric and measurable reality. If you find this helpful, feel free to leave a comment and share your perspective respectfully.